From time to time, I hear people saying, oh, African Americans, they have a higher crime rate. And then some people will go farther and they'll say, well, they're more prone to violence. Now, we've shown statistics in this show over and over that show you that, in fact, the same amount of crime is being committed in the same percentages for whites and blacks. It's just, for example, in drugs, you have a stark case where African Americans get arrested at 4 times the rate, even though the usage is the same. Now, that drives me crazy for a couple reasons. But one, because it's not true, and two, because it turns history on its head. African Americans are more violent? Are you kidding me? Have you not read any history of the United States of America? So for those of you who haven't and who still saying things like that, let me clarify the violence that African Americans suffered in this country. They just did a thorough analysis, many different groups, and they've actually been keeping records since 1882. The Chicago Tribune started keeping records, and then many different organizations like the Tuskegee Institute and the NAACP started tracking these, and they finally brought them all together and tried to figure out how many lynchings there have been in this country. They found some records that even predated the Chicago Tribune, and they looked at just 12 southern states between 1877 to 1950. Turns out there were 3,959 victims of what they call racial terror lynchings. These are the original terrorists of America. The guys who did these lynchings, whether they were in the Klan, whether it was more informal, it was in a local town, it was in a big town. Well, there's a new group that is trying to lay out markers in these different towns to show where that happened so that you can't ignore history. Now, if you go throughout the South, which I've been all over the South, you'll see memorials everywhere for the Civil War. Our good soldiers fought here, Confederate soldiers. And when you look for memorials marking other parts of Southern history, you don't get any of that. So the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama decided they're going to change that. So they did research into this, and they want to lay out the markers for all of those different lynchings, where they happened and how they happened. Yes, it's uncomfortable. There's no question about that. A lot of our history is uncomfortable. But you got to know the truth. I hear that the truth shall set you free. So we go to some experts here. One of them is Professor Beck, and he's done a lot of research here. And the New York Times explains, among Professor Beck's findings were that the number of lynchings did not rise or fall in proportion to the number of state-sanctioned executions, underscoring what Mr. Stevenson said was a crucial point, that these brutal deaths were not about administering popular justice, but terrorizing a community. So I want to give you that as background when I describe some of what happened. So you're not under the mistaken assumption, well, it was a terrible form of justice, but these people had done something wrong. Well, in a great majority of the cases, they had done nothing wrong. It wasn't them in the first place. And Professor Beck explains further, many of these lynchings were not executing people for crimes, but executing people for violating the racial hierarchy. So now, having given you that background, let me share some of these stories. Now, of course, the descriptions themselves are gruesome. I'm in civil rights museums, including one in Alabama. I've seen some of the pictures, and they are stomach-turning. Okay. First story they have here in the New York Times is about a man named Curvin. They explain, a town named Curvin. In Curvin, where 3 black men, 2 of them almost certainly innocent, were accused of killing a white woman, and under the gaze of hundreds of soda-drinking spectators, were castrated, stabbed, beaten, tied to a plow, and set afire in the spring of 1922. Now, part of the reason they do that is, of course, to show what their place is, and to punish that guy, and to take out their aggression and their anger against that poor guy. Of course, the other reason is to put terror in the hearts of every other black person in that area. They see that and they know Don't you ever dare cross a white person under any circumstance. So recently reading about Joe Frazier, the legendary boxing champion, he said, he grew up in the South, he said once a white guy, and this is in our lifetimes, right, took out a belt and threatened to beat a black guy with it. Joe Frazier stepped in and said, don't you dare do that to me. You know what happened next? He had to leave town. He had to pack up his bags, leave his family, leave his home forever, and get out of town because he didn't know what was going to happen next, because usually what happened next was horrible, horrible violence for the crime of asking to not be beaten with a belt. This is way past slavery. And in the Joe Frazier story, it's in the Jim Crow era. Now, earlier here, you see that after slavery, during Jim Crow, during a broader stretch of time, it is nothing but terror for African Americans in the South. Now, it was terrible things going on in the North as well, but this concentrates on the 12 southern states. Here's another story. In 1910, a group of men rushed into a courthouse. They threw a rope around the neck of a black man accused of sexually assaulting a 3-year-old white girl. Through the other end of the rope, out a window, a mob outside yanked the man, Alan Brooks, to the ground and strung him up at a ceremonial arch a few blocks down Main Street. Can you imagine if you're that guy? The great majority of these cases, they didn't do it, right? They throw the noose around your neck and they start pulling it from the street. The terror must have been indescribable. Third case. Farther south still is the community of Streetman, where 25-year-old George Gay was hanged from a tree and shot hundreds of times in 1922. Not enough to kill the guy, stabbed, beaten, castrated, burned, hung, shot hundreds of times. It's a lesson. Know your role, know your place, never raise your head. One more story for you guys, and obviously there are thousands of these stories. I just want to give you a sense of what actually happened in this country. Thousands of people came in 1893 to see Henry Smith, a black teenager accused of murder, carried around town on a float, then tortured and burned to death on a scaffold. Now, in that same Civil Rights Museum in Alabama, I saw that sometimes they would have a picnic around the body. They would do all the things described here, hang, burn, castrate, and then, as one of the stories here explained, they'd have a soda pop around the guy. Sometimes they'd bring their families, literally, and they'd set out picnic grounds, and at the end, as a memento, they would take home a piece of the body. Imagine if ISIS did that today, any other group did that today. Wouldn't we immediately go to war against them? Wouldn't we say they were the most barbaric human beings we had ever met? I mean, if ever the word terrorism is to be applied to anything, wouldn't this be it? But what happens in our history? Oftentimes it is, quite literally, whitewashed out. There are no markers, there are no memorials. We're not supposed to remember because, boy, that would be uncomfortable. And I don't like that, I don't agree with that. But maybe I could live with it because, do you really want to tell kids when they're growing up and they're taking history classes this stuff? My answer would be yes, very much yes, so that we don't do it again. Why do we teach the Holocaust? Because we don't want to do it again, never again, right? So it doesn't matter white, black, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, it doesn't matter, never again. That's why we teach it. But what I can't stomach is, if you're in that camp that says we shouldn't teach it, it's not right for kids to know this, it's too early, too young, maybe you save it for college. And then you turn around and tell me blacks are more violent than other races. No, no, no. That I cannot abide. Know your history, know the truth. And this is part of it, even if it makes us uncomfortable, it is reality, and it's part of this American story with its great upsides and its great downsides. It is a part of the reality of what we are as a country. We have gotten beyond this, which is a great thing, and we should celebrate that we got beyond it. But it is also part of our legacy, and it's what's brought us to this point. You got to understand it, you got to know it, and you got to confront it. It is what it is. And now at least you know.